this should be school board. Rename, because this is unmuted. This should be me, and this should be me. Name, and we want to make post. Make sure post. Okay, so this is me.
Good evening and welcome to the Monday, February 14th, 2022 School Board Work Session. The time is now 7 p.m. The school board would like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge we are residing on the traditional land of the Dene people. Our mission is to provide an excellent, equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse, changing society. Mrs. Tuttle, can we please get the roll call?
Mr. Sampson?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Matheson is excused. Mr. Doran?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Sanderson?
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Marati?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Smith?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Luke?
Here.
Thank you. The board has a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Tuttle. Our agenda item this evening is the fiscal year 2022-2023 proposed budget presentation. Core value, center everything we do on the student and student learning. Chief School Administrator Karen Moline and Andrew DeGora, Chief Operations Officer, will present the administration's fiscal year 2022-2023 proposed budget. I'd like to turn the time over to administration.
Thank you, President Luke. So to begin this work, I have a bit of an analogy. On May 20th, 1927, Charles Lindbergh took off from New York in what he hoped to be the first transatlantic flight to land in Paris. 33 and a half hours later and 3,600 miles later, he landed. Lindbergh designed his Ryan aircraft for this specific mission. He expanded the amount of fuel that could be carried, completely designed a new airplane that had actually fuel tanks in front of the pilot, which meant that he couldn't see out the front of the airplane. He went through each design feature with one thing in mind, and that was to complete his mission. In paring down the weight, every detail was considered. If it was too heavy or unnecessary, it was left behind. And so this included a radio. He took with him no parachute, no gas gauges, and no navigation lights. He designed lightweight gear for himself, boots specially designed for his mission. Even his pilot seat, the heavy leather seat, was taken out, and a lighter weight wicker chair was put in instead. He went so far as to trim down all of the paper, excess paper around the maps, and took with him only the points of reference that he was going to need. So I kind of feel like a little bit of the Charles Lindbergh process took place as we built this budget. It's our job to present to this board a balanced budget. So in that process, we got down to trimming the excess paper off of the maps so we could make this journey. This was an extremely emotional process for me and for the team because it's not just money, it's people. And while we look at the dollars every day, there's no moment in time in the conversation that we don't realize that it's people and it's kids. And sometimes it bumped up against my fundamental belief of the purpose of this organization, and that's as a learning organization. So this was an emotional process for us, and it's going to be an emotional journey for the community of educators, of people that are dedicated to making this a great learning organization. So with that, we're going to launch into what we have designed as our proposed budget, and we have done our best to deliver this organization across our deficit intact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. DeGraw to start laying out for you the pieces of our proposed budget.
Thank you, Ms. Moline. Just before I jump into the presentation tonight, I just want to echo Ms. Moline's comments, and just that this, I would say this was the most difficult budget preparation that I've experienced in my career. I've been working with school districts for about 13 years now, and definitely a significant challenge. But It's been been appreciative of the process. It's been a thoughtful process, and the challenges are real. But I think we're up to the task, and we're starting the beginning of the process of charting a path forward. I'm grateful for the partnership with Ms. Moline that I've had. And the last week and a half has been a scramble, and I'm very proud of the people that I work with, and want to thank Sharon, Ms. Tuttle, for her patience with my office and a few things kind of towards the end of the deadline windows. And then also, I'd be remiss to not thank Miss Sandy Weaver and Nico Herbert for their excellent work throughout this process. They're really the faces behind the scenes, and it's awesome to have them here tonight. But just awesome. And the accounting department in general pitching in to be the eyes and review just hundreds and hundreds of pages and thousands of lines, and I'm just very, very pleased with the teamwork and the partnerships that have been created and put together to bring the board the proposed budget tonight. So without further ado, we'll jump in. You should have the printed copy of a new presentation. We prettied it up. Pretty much the same information that was provided on Thursday, and we'll get this new presentation posted immediately if it's not already there, but it will be there. Again, same information, just presented, I think, in a more digestible manner for the board as well as the public. So to start out with, we're outlining the numbers that have been gone over in prior meetings. Our projected FY23 deficit is approximately $19 million, and the estimated FY24 deficit is at $23 million, and we'll get into the specifics of those numbers towards the end of this outline, the jump from 19 to 23. This slide illustrates the current FY23 deficit and what makes up that deficit. We began with approximately $12 million from a $12 million deficit. Those are general fund expenditures that are currently floating on CARES. So last year we made significant reductions to the general fund budget, and not all of those reductions, but a majority of those reductions we came back in around with CARES funds and restored many of them. Again, not all. That's our beginning baseline deficit. We have an additional approximately $3.5 million in loss from the hold harmless clause for our state foundation funding, where this will be year 3. So we'll be held harmless to 25% of the enrollment decline we experienced in FY20. The $2.0 million revenue loss, that is associated with assessed valuations here in the borough. Those increased values increase the minimum required local contribution, which is subtracted from state revenue. So an increase in a number that's subtracted from our state revenue. So increased assessed valuation equals a loss in the state side of the revenue. And then the last $1.5 million loss is attributable to our enrollment decline, our enrollment projection from the approved budget that we're currently in to our projected enrollment for next year, and we'll go over that here in a minute. So a total of $19 million deficit for FY23. Student enrollment, so there you see 12,458. That was our enrollment for our current year FY22 approved budget. Actual enrollment came in at 12,268, so just shy of 300 students, shy of a 200 student decline, excuse me. And then our projected enrollment for FY23 is 12,191. So overall, about a roughly 270, 280 student enrollment decline from our projected approved FY22 enrollment. Enrollment trend long term, it's a 10-year look back from FY22. So FY22, we're currently there at 12,268. Going back 10 years, about a 2,000 student decline over that 10-year period of time. And there you see in 21 the significant decline there due to the pandemic. General fund revenues for FY '23. So here's our projections. We have about 54% of our revenue attributed to state foundation funding, 28% local revenue, and 8% and 8% between impact aid and our, the 8% for retirement on behalf, that's considered state revenue. We'll go over revenue in detail here in a minute, and that 8% of on behalf is included in our state revenue. So there at the bottom is approximately a $7.5 million decrease on the revenue side from FY '22 to FY '23. Again, a revenue trend over the last 10 years, 10-year look back from FY '22, current year. Just important to note that in 2013, we were receiving about $220 million in revenue, and then projected revenue for FY '23 down to 183. So the simple math there is at about a $37, $38 million decrease in revenue, and that's revenue every year. That's not a cumulative number, that's a every year compared to 2013. Look at fund balance, and we're going to look at fund balance, two main calculations that we look at, and two very different calculations. On the state side, the state calculation for FY '21, we're at $0 in our general fund balance. And just the board's very aware of the policy that we have. Roughly 6 to 8% of general fund expenditures is board policy that we strive to maintain. On the borough calculation side of things, and this is going to be a slight difference from what we received on Thursday, what we put out. My 6.1 number I had was my notes. And as of the completion of our FY '21 audit, that number settled at $5.9 million. And those funds, most of those funds reside in three different funds: risk, equipment replacement, and then there also is some fund balance in the transportation fund. Important to note that those funds are all committed for a specific purpose, and they certainly aren't unrestricted in nature. Unrestricted funds there, as you can see, in the general fund is $0 in the borough calculation as well. Then a visual of our 10-year trend on fund balance, actually a 9-year, I think, technically. Significant increase 2015 through 17, and then we've seen a significant decrease on the downside from 2018 down to 21. Kind of, I think my folks can see my cursor, yeah. This decline right here was due in large part to budgeting fund balance as a revenue source, as well as the agreement that the district made with the borough to complete roofs at Eielson and Wood River. And then this significant decline here from 20 to 21 would be due to the enrollment loss, the student enrollment loss between 20 and 21. I'll just quickly run through timeline just to give the board a refresher, and then as well as the general public. September, October, and November, the budget committee convenes, and then district administration is gathering information from schools, departments, and programs, and setting priorities and establishing objectives that the district would like to accomplish through the budget. December, January, myself, along with Ms. Moline and my office, put together a proposed budget through the months of December and January. And then here we are in February. Typically, that's the first regular meeting, and the day before that is when we introduce the proposed budget. This year was unique in that we were dealing with school closures, and so we delayed that presentation of the budget by 2 weeks until now. Then in February and March, the board works that proposed budget and starts the process of receiving input through various channels from various stakeholders, and then works towards the recommended budget, which is the second version, which the board adopts the latter part of March. We'll have a deadline, really. We'll want to kind of be wrapped up right around the 25th of March at the latest, and that gives my office the time to put together that final recommended to send over to the borough. That's due on April 1st. And then the assembly through April and May receives our budget and works that request of the local contribution into their borough-wide budget. And then in June typically is when the board is approving the final approved budget. And then my office has to prepare that and present it to the state by July 15th. Budget assumptions for this FY23 budget. So we're assuming at this point a status quo BSA of 5930, a decrease in enrollment that was reflected in a prior slide of 294 students compared to the approved budget enrollment. And then we are assuming an increase in the local contribution of $2 million. One other assumption, a significant component of this proposed budget is that we have built into this budget a step for all eligible employees. However, this is assuming a 0% increase to cells within the various salary schedules. So 0% increase to individual cells in the salary schedules, but it is assuming a step for all eligible employees district-wide. So here we're getting into some of the charts in the proposed budget book. This is revenue projections for all funds. I'll go through a couple of these. General fund is the top line, 183 million that I referenced earlier. There you can see the far right column shows the variance in each fund, about $7.5 million decrease from FY22. And then you have nutrition services and student transportation, the next two funds. Similar numbers in nutrition services. That's a reflection of school closures for the most part. And then in student transportation, that reduction is reflected in fewer anticipated routes. We're contracted for 130 routes, and administration felt it was safe to assume a smaller route number. That's the 800,000 rough decline in the student transportation budget. One other fund I want to point out is the federal programs line. So typically in a normal year, that line includes our consolidated grants. So Title I, our 6B11 special ed grants, those consolidated grants. And we're typically assuming around $11 million. In FY22, we added the CARES 2 amount to that 11 million to come up with the 20.7 million. The FY23 proposed number is the 11 million consolidated grant baseline plus CARES 3, which is 21 million and change. So, well, it's 21, probably 21,8, 22,860, because it's 11, that minus 11 million is the CARES 3 total amount that the district will be receiving. And we'll go into some CARES details in subsequent slides.
We have some questions. Ms. Moretti?
Oh, just could you repeat those numbers again? Thank you. The 11 million plus.
Yeah, so 11 million is the consolidated grant baseline amount that the district receives each year, roughly that amount. And then the CARES 3 number is going to be 21 million and change. It's going to be in the 21.8 million range. And then CARES 2 was approximately 9.7, 9.8 million. And we'll see those numbers in subsequent slides, exact numbers.
And can you just let us know what the projected number of routes are for transportation, please?
We'll confirm with Mr. Hinton. It's somewhere between 110 and 120. I'll get an exact number for you.
Thank you.
Okay. So the general fund revenue, will break out that by local, state, and federal dollars. So this is an itemization of local revenue. So there, the top line, you can see the assumed $2 million increase, and specifically the ask of the local contribution. And then other local revenue sources below that. Main ones are building rentals there at the bottom line, and then other local sources, that's things like rebates on our P card usage, as well as some rebates from GVEA and other utility companies here in town. So a total increase of $2 million to $52,602,400. Our state revenue, here you see the decrease in foundation funding of about 7.3 million. And then we're assuming the other big item that changes on a yearly basis are the bottom two lines, TERS and PERS on behalf, so supplemental payments that the state makes to prop up the retirement system. And those, we typically will update those between recommended and approved. Salaries often move many times in the budget process, and so we whittle it down to one update all at once. But that's won't impact operations, as that's a pass-through. We receive the revenue and it goes straight back out, back to the state, so it does not impact the budget. And then federal revenue, the main item there is impact aid, and we'll likely see a significant decline as we are seeing in our state revenue due to the enrollment drop. So those numbers there, mostly obviously unchanged minus the impact aid number. And we have been seeing a steady decline in those numbers over the last 2 to 3 years. So here a summary of all three there, just to see the 183,601 is what we're projecting for 23 compared to current year approved revenue, for a difference of approximately $7.5 million. This slide itemizes out our expenses by function. So these are the ways that we segregate expenditures by function, which is an accounting term, but by category: instruction, general instruction is the top line, special ed, student support services, school administration, district admin, et cetera, et cetera. And there you can see an itemized line by line difference in the different categories by function. And then expenditures by category, kind of rolling it up to bigger categories, so salaries and wages, and then benefits. So oftentimes you'll hear me talk about salaries and benefits as a percentage of overall general fund expenditures. That's those two top line categories. And then our contracted services, supplies and materials, and equipment to round things out. The other category there at the bottom is our transfers to other funds. And the two common funds there are nutrition services and sometimes transportation. And all of these charts are in the main budget book that you all have as well. So the goal of our proposed budget is to, bottom line, it's, people are already tired of me probably hearing about the numbers, but ultimately our goal is to focus on providing the highest quality education that we have with the resources that are afforded to us. And so that's what's constantly guiding us here at an administrative level. And as I mentioned before, Ms. Moline mentioned, it's been a difficult process because this is huge. We're in the business of educating students, and we want to do it the best we can. And so we take that very seriously. So we're going to summarize the reductions and investments in the three main categories of elementary schools, secondary schools, and district-wide programs. So here it's important to note, and the language here on this slide talks about that allocations are adjusted based on current enrollment as well as PTR, the people-to-teacher ratio. Important to point out, and I'll just say this in case I forget it further down in the presentation, is last year the board approved higher PTRs in the general fund budget as part of that budget process. We used CARES funding to come back in and maintain the lower PTRs. And so in this budget, our proposed budget, is actually eliminating CARES usage to maintain those lower PTR numbers. So technically, we're not proposing an increase to PTR, but we're actually implementing the higher PTR that was approved that we didn't implement because we used CARES funding to maintain it. If that, did I just make sense there? It's kind of a wonky So,
Ms. Marati?
No, that didn't make sense.
so last year, the board approved through our budget process, in the budget book, we approved an increase in class size. But we came back in around and used CARES funds to preserve the smaller class sizes. And so while officially the PTR was increased, that wasn't necessarily felt, it wasn't felt out in the schools because we maintained the smaller class sizes with more teachers with CARES funds. This proposed budget, we are proposing to eliminate the usage of those CARES funds to continue to fund the lower class sizes from 2 years ago. And so while there's not an official increase that we're proposing, the net effect will be schools feeling an increase to the PTR because our proposal is to cease to use CARES funds for those additional teachers to maintain the smaller PTR.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, just so I know my numbers. In the budget book on page 8, the district profile says the target class size was 25 in elementary. Okay. That was before our approved budget? Or after our approved, because our approved budget included the CARES that lowered.
So the example, the way what I've just described went into play was the kindergarten PTR prior to that 25, it was 22 and a half, I believe. And so we funded that we approved a 2.5 student increase to class sizes, but we maintained the 22.5 student class sizes with CARES funds.
Right, because that was part of our approved budget. Those CARES were part of our approved budget, right? Or am I wrong?
Yes, well, yes, we approved general fund budget and we approved CARES budget.
All right, so it was actually our target last year, for this year, was 22.5 and all of them were lower.
Yep. And to maintain that 22.5 with CARES funds, yes.
Right, so that was our target for last year, for this year. And our proposed target for next year in this budget is to be really what's reflected on this page as this year's. Is that what I'm understanding?
Can you repeat that question, Mr. Doran?
Okay, so for the 21-22 school year, let's say at kindergarten, our approved budget was a target at kindergarten of 22.5.
Let me clarify. The budget book, however, the approved general fund budget book increased the PTR to 25.
So CARES was not part of that approved budget, it was supplemental to that approved budget.
It was not part of this book. CARES was not.
Of the approved budget.
It was approved as an add-on supplemental budget.
After the approved.
Correct. So that's kind of the distinguishing factor, I believe, might not be, but this book that the board approved increased the official class size to 25 in kindergarten, for example. And then in a process subsequent to approving this book, the board approved the utilization of approximately $3 million in CARES funds to maintain the 22.5 prior year class size.
All right, thank you for clarifying. I thought that was part of our approved, finalized budget. And I thought it was the same motion. So we are looking to increase PTR unless we continue to use CARES.
The net effect will be felt in increasing class size, absent the board approving additional utilization of CARES funds to maintain that prior PTR.
Okay, and that is, when we get to CARES, I'll see whether it's in there or not.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to preface that to start the illustrations of elementary, secondary, district-wide reductions and investments. On the reduction side, 38.6 certified staff FTE reductions in elementary schools. So part of that is PTR, but a bigger portion of that is 6th grade students leaving the elementary ranks and going over to the secondary ranks in middle school. So that was a significant chunk of those 38 reductions. And then additionally, a 1.0 program secretary at Barnett, as well as a 0.5 FTE teacher at Barnett, and that's specifically the exploratory, out of the exploratory allocation of teachers. And then school closures listed as well. On the secondary side, so here, it's a 7.1 FTE certified staff investment. However, that's again because of those 6th grade teachers entering the secondary rank. So absent that move, it's also a net reduction to secondary. Additionally, investments in the secondary ranks to address those middle schools filling up to significantly higher capacities. So 3 safety assistants at middle schools, 1 assistant principal, a secretary, 1 CTE teacher, that would be in the high school ranks, and then a 0.5 FTE counselor. That's back at the middle school ranks. And then reductions for FTE grade 6 secretaries at the high school level, 1 of those at the middle school level, and then 2 FTE teachers at Hutchinson, their small school allocation. Currently at 5 FTE for the small school allocation, reduced to 3. And then district-wide, so significant list here. Investments as well as reductions. You'll see kind of a common theme on the investment side. We took significant items from CARES and put them back in the general fund budget. So we felt it extremely important for a couple of reasons. First, just to show our commitment to our special ed department and the importance of that work, but also we realized by reducing general fund sped expenditures, we started to get into the territory of being awry on our MOE calculation, our maintenance of effort calculations. So in order to maintain our special ed federal grants, we're required to maintain specific levels of special ed funding to receive those federal special ed grants. So to address that, we've restored 24 FTE special ed positions from CARES back to the general fund. 3.3 ELL staff back to the general fund. We've added 2 FTE in the nursing ranks. That's been a significant challenge. I think we've successfully navigated a reorganization of our nursing services that we're providing to schools. So part of that is adding a couple of FTE there. 1 best teacher due to increased enrollment that we talk about often. A 0.5 ASP staff member. And then best allotments, so the allotments to students, we've had to significantly increase because of that increased enrollment. And then the last item, cybersecurity software in our IT department. On the reduction side, so a reduction in the benefit rate, and that's the benefit rate that we charge to provide benefits. We charge that rate to each salary, and I'll speak in a few moments about that a little more in detail. 3.0 reduction of shift custodians, 2 FTE reduction at Star of the North, a 1.0 reduction at CEC, a 1.0 network technician decrease, 0.5 and 0.5 of the 2 union president reimbursements, and then 5 paid days reduction in paid days to our school term ESSA employees. And then this next slide is kind of a summary, and just there's gonna be a lot of numbers, especially when we delve into CARES. There's gonna be a lot of numbers floating around all at once, and I have several summary slides that I'm gonna summarize and really kind of bottom line it, combining general fund and CARES budgets into one to see the differences in the proposals. So this is a summary of our general fund staff reductions. And staff reductions happened in 2 areas. They happened in the general fund, and they also happened in our CARES proposed budget that I'll go over shortly. So the bottom line here is a reduction of 29.43 staff members. And you can see, again, this is by function, similar to the expenditure by function slide. This itemizes the staff reductions by function. So 29 FTE reduction in our general fund budget. Any questions, or should I keep going? We'll pivot into CARES. Okay, here we go. So CARES, before I jump into FY23 proposed CARES, we'll review FY22 CARES 2 and 3 expenditures. We'll compare those to overall total budgets, and that'll help us identify available resources moving into FY23. So with CARES 2, we started with 9.7 million. Our planned expenditures are 8.3 million, a little bit additional in staffing and a little bit additional in our summer school program. So a total FY22 expenditure expectation out of CARES 2 of approximately 8.4 million. That leaves 1.3 million that will be available for FY23, and we're going to see these numbers roll to a subsequent slide. In CARES 3, we're currently expected to expend about $4.6 million in FY22, a couple $100,000 in summer school, some technology upgrades, other costs, and then an indirect cost applied to CARES 3. We did not apply the indirect cost to CARES 2, just to be able to dedicate more dollars to staff. Total expenditures of a little over $8 million, which leaves 13.8 million approximately remaining for FY23. And there you do see there on the bottom right, about 15.1 million we're anticipating is going to be available for FY23. Subject to change, we see significant movement constantly. One of the big, for budgeting purposes, we're required to use averages, not knowing oftentimes what staff members are going to occupy specific positions. And so as things play out, numbers become more clear, and you know, it's happened several times now where one person takes one job, they have an opportunity to take a different position, maybe back in the general fund, and they take a different position and we fill it with a new person. So just want the board to remember these are figures that are constantly moving and changing on a weekly basis. So CARES 2, we funded, and then total FTE at the bottom, we funded about 123 FTE with CARES 2 and about 51 FTE in CARES 3 in the current year for a total of about 174 positions. We'll jump now to our FY23 CARES proposed budget. So here's the 15.1 million starting point from the prior slide. Our proposed staffing costs, and I'm going to jump to a separate slide here in just a moment. It's a slide that you all have in your packet, but I'll jump to that to itemize this 8.3 million in staffing costs that we're proposing for FY23. Additional summer school and then other costs for a total of just shy of 9.2 million in proposed that should be FY '23 expenditures. Total FTE of about 99.5, just shy of 100. Gonna jump to detail here. So here, and this illustration you received in your packet on Thursday, and this itemizes, make it a little bit bigger. This itemizes the just shy of $9.2 million in proposed expenditures. You can see where we're proposing to expend those dollars. About 30 classroom teachers. So I'll just go over the highlights. About 30 classroom teachers, $3.5 million. Continuing elementary math and literacy tutors at the schools. Those supports have been hugely beneficial at elementary schools, middle schools, and charters. Just shy of $2 million for those tutor aid supports. Here, as part of the reorganization of our nursing program that I referenced earlier, we've implemented 4 nurse managers right here for a total of about $500,000. And then the other major line is towards the bottom, 7 FTE of maintenance positions to maintain those maintenance positions in the FMD department. So that's a summary of our proposed FY '23 CARES budget.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, where we're on that CARES 3, when we say classroom teachers, is that, what's the PTR connection with that? And what is that PTR?
That is implementing the higher PTRs, and that represents $3.5 million of funds that we don't have in the general fund right now to pay for those teachers.
Okay, so it is an increase in PTR for this coming year.
Yes.
And the CARES money that we used for this year to keep PTR at the 2021 level is not, that somewhere that's lost.
Yes.
This is not this is not keeping that going.
That's correct, Mr. Dorn.
So it's an increase of PTR by, maybe we could get the chart. I don't have it in front of me. Or what I know kindergarten you mentioned was 22 and a half.
Here, right here, I'm putting that up on the screen. So this was CARES 2. This is how we have implemented the board-approved CARES 2 list from last May. I think it was May, was a lot of the late April, May time period. And here you can see the top line, the roughly 33 FTE in teachers that we utilize to maintain. We had an additional amount of classroom teachers in CARES 3 as well. The total was around between 50 and 55 certified classroom teachers that we carried current year in CARES. And our proposal is to reduce that from 50 to 55 down to 30. That's roughly your reduction in PTR, or your increase in class size that you're referencing.
Okay. And when we're saying, so on the CARES 2, where it has for FY '22.
Back there, right here. Yep.
Okay, where it says maintains 2022 PTR, it actually maintained the 2021 PTR.
Correct.
And so the new one for there's three. Is actually to increase PTR.
Yes, it's implementing the PTR approved in FY '22. It's implementing that higher PTR by not funding the additional teachers it takes to maintain the lower PTR with CARES funds.
And perhaps just at some point, I guess if I go back and further books, I'm just looking for what that 2021 PTR that we put in place, that we implemented last year, what those numbers are.
Okay, yeah, we can.
So we can see what the increase in PTR is for this.
Yeah, it was around a couple, we'll get the exact numbers, but it was roughly a couple of students per grade level.
And that's what I think it is, but if, just
Yep,
for accuracy.
we'll get the numbers, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Sanderson?
Yeah, could you talk to me about the 110,000 for the CEC lease and custodial? Because I thought the last we had for your CEC cost was 35,000 at 0.5 FTE.
Where are you referencing, Ms. Sanderson?
Scenario B.
Okay, if it's okay, I'm gonna get to scenario B, and could I address that question when we get to scenario B? Is that okay?
I thought that's where we were. Sorry.
No, we're still on scenario A. Ms. Sanderson's excited to get moving, so I can.
Mr. Dorn?
I will absolutely answer that question, Ms. Sanderson.
Keeping in mind we're not on B before we get there. The $2 million increase to the borough request is, though yes, it is a dollar change, it actually makes us whole, it represents more a status quo. Am I being too simplistic with that, in that it's just making up for, sensibly, they will get $2 million more from property evaluations. The state is, so we're not really asking for more as much as we're asking to keep us whole, because that state comes off the state.
Yeah, I see your line of thinking. I'm not expert enough in the borough's finances to be able to confirm that. Right. So I think as we get more into the process, as we start to interact and work with the borough on securing a local contribution, we can certainly get into the details of that. Absolutely, I look forward to those conversations.
Okay. Mr. Sampson?
Thank you. I know we're trying to hold questions to the end. I also just want to reiterate that I want clarification on the state's increased valuation of the borough's net worth and how that plays out to the borough as far as funding goes, and how that relates to our increased ask. If the $2 million is in line with that, are we below, above? I'd like details on that also. Thank you.
Yeah, those certainly will be good topics to engage with the borough on.
Mr. Dorn?
And again, I know tonight we're doing more global things, and we'll get into specifics later, but with that idea of the big picture, that $19 million deficit, I'm trying to figure out where we are in covering that, and where CARES proposal fits in that. Is that, so if I read this correctly, it's about $9 million that the administration is recommending to be used. does that take away from that 19 million? So that we're at 10 million and then, so I guess what I'm looking at, you mentioned the 3 million school closures, two buildings closed, one not. Potentially 2 million coming from the state, from the borough. 9 million from CARES. So, I don't know, about 14 million, you know, I'm looking for the, where the other 5 is coming.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
That's
where I'm
good.
going?
Yep, good question, Mr. Doran. So here's how it breaks down. Yes, 3 million, so 19, 3 million school closures, 16, 2 million additional asks from the borough, 14. And here, when you get to CARES, it starts to get a little tricky. So recall, the way I'm establishing our starting point deficit for each year is how much we're carrying on CARES in general fund, regular general fund expenditures. So that number is about 7 million. 7 million of it is regular general fund expenditures that we had going before CARES came online. The other 2 million is the supplemental tutors and math and literacy aids that we have out in schools, the additional supports to help address COVID learning loss. Now, the reality is, at some point when CARES funds is exhausted, we'll have to reduce those as well. But that just makes the deficit bigger. So the number I'm subtracting from the 14 for CARES utilization is of 7 million.
Okay,
So
makes sense.
if we're sticking with apples to apples, and then that leaves, we've cut approximately $7 million in expenditures between the general fund and the CARES expenses for current year.
Okay, and if I might do a follow-up.
Go ahead.
Okay, so in this budget, as we go through get into details later, there's CARES money factored into this now.
No, this is general fund alone.
All right, so if the CARES brings back 30 teachers, if we go with the 9 million, it brings back 30 teachers as proposed under CARES, does that reduce then the numbers of reductions?
Describe what you mean by bring back 30 to maintain the lower PTR?
So the CARES is not in here,
Correct.
and there are about, rough number, about 30 teachers we're seeing reductions.
Yeah, it's 20 to 30.
Okay.
Yep.
The proposed CARES is 30 FTEs.
Mhm.
That would make those positions whole, because we're now adding in another.
We're reducing in the general fund, we're reducing teachers, but we're also reducing in CARES funds teachers
Right,
as well.
right. About 25 teachers mentioned. But we've got 30 in the proposal for CARES
Mhm.
to bring back.
Correct.
That would then lessen the number of teaching reductions in here, because they're not in here already.
No, I'm gonna, so in a subsequent slide, I'm gonna summarize total general fund reductions and have side by side with that CARES funds reductions as well.
Okay, I'll wait for that.
It's
then.
almost in a
Great.
sense, Mr. Dorn, that we're running two budgets in parallel. And that's really, we have to segregate our CARES expenditures from our general fund expenditures.
Okay, I'll wait until you go
Okay.
side by side and then see whether it helps my clarity. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. So here's an itemized list of how we have shifted from the changes from current FY22 CARES expenditures to proposed FY23 CARES expenditures. So these are the changes that we made. It's just like we itemize out the changes we make here in the general fund budget, secondary and elementary and district-wide. This is the equivalent of that for our CARES funds, okay? So this far left column moved out, meaning we took it out of CARES, but these programs all found another home, okay? So our 1.0 military support coordinator, we've moved that over to a new DODEA grant, okay? That's currently in FY22 CARES. 2.4 ELL staff over back to the general fund. 1.0 best program secretary back to the general fund. And then the 24 SPED staff that I referenced earlier in the general fund slide back to general fund. The middle column is the reduction. So here, this might start to get to, I don't know if it gets to your questions, Mr. Doran, but we're reducing 28.6 classroom teachers from CARES. Okay, we're reducing 11.0 shift custodians, 6 e-learning teachers, 2.1 activity coordinators, and 4.5 other positions, miscellaneous positions. Added to CARES is the far right column. 1 recruiting tech in our HR department, 4 nurse managers that we referenced earlier, 1 maintenance position in the FMD department, and then a 0.2 district-wide music. The 0.2, it's kind of an odd number. We're proposing a 3.0 district-wide music, and currently we're at 2.8. So that's the 0.2 add. So that's a summary of the changes from FY22 budget, CARES budget, to proposed. That's what administration is proposing in changes to our CARES expenditures.
Mr. Doran?
I'm sorry if I'm thick, but these on here are not in here. Okay.
Yeah, just imagine 2 separate budgets. It took me several weeks to wrap my head around this concept. It's as we were coming up on budget season, it was a situation to where I realized all kind of in one moment, you know, and think about it as we worked through things last year. We had the general fund budget, and the speed at which we were doing things probably made things a little bit difficult to digest, but we approved CARES expenditures, and they were outside of the general fund, outside of this book, the process that we followed to approve CARES. And so we'll follow the same process this year. So here we get to scenario B. Ms. Sanderson referenced that. Just for the public, for general information, as well as for the board, we had specific timelines that my office had to begin putting together our proposed budget. We waited significantly longer this time around, which made things quite difficult. That's why I apologized and thanked Ms. Tuttle for her patience in waiting. We had to delay the work on our budget significantly because of big moving parts that we've had to grapple with here in the last few weeks. One of those, and many assumptions go into all of the budgets we put together. The scenario A was put together, what we just completed going over, was put together with the negotiation season coming upon us, was made with some assumptions in the healthcare arena that we were hopeful that we would be able to get some traction and kind of some acknowledgement and buy-in on the financial situation that we're confronted with here in the district. And so we made certain assumptions in the first budget that we've looked at. As we digested the initial proposals, we realized at a certain point that we couldn't afford to take those assumptions that you know, we're going to have to approve a budget, a recommended budget, to go over to the borough that in a time frame that it's not really possible for us to have any kind of knowledge of any agreement that we'll be able to come to with the bargaining units. And so this scenario B, what it's doing is it's taking our existing negotiated agreements and it's carrying those forward into FY23 without the assumptions that were baked in the healthcare arena baked into the numbers. And so this will illustrate the differences. It equaled out to an additional $3.2 million in cuts that we had to find. And we'll go through those right now. So this is the illustration of increased cost to the district. That's on the far right. So we'll go over that first. So earlier I referenced a reduction in the benefit rate, the rate that we charge all general fund salaries. That's to pay for health insurance claims and among other benefits that we provide to staff. And so absent an agreement in the area of health insurance, in this scenario B, we increase the benefit rate back to the current, so no change. So in your budget book, you'll see no change in this scenario B. In the scenario B packet, you'll see the same benefit rate that we currently have for FY22. And then we've restored the 0.5 FTE reimbursements for the presidents for the bargaining units as well. In the packets you received, it also had one more bullet point of restoring the 5 paid days to ESSA school term employees, and that was an error, and so that I removed that in the slide presentation. So in scenario B, the proposal of reducing those 5 days remains. So there's in the middle column and the far left column, there's 2 categories. The middle column is reductions, so those are cuts. And the far left are cuts from the general fund, so reductions from the book, but restored with CARES. Does that make sense? So outright reductions in the middle column, and then far left is reductions from the general fund, but restored with CARES. So teaching assistants, and specifically in the kindergarten ranks, 14.0, 3.0 FTE high school counselors, 1 media production specialist, that's a position here in the ADC, 0.9 custodian positions. Those are specifically related to our Bridge program and CEC program. So just for full, and we'll see this in, I think this is what Ms. Sanderson was getting at, in the proposed budget, we're proposing the moving of the CEC program. And then 20% reduction to round out the middle column, a 20% reduction to student activities, as well as district-wide supply budgets. And then the far left column, we're proposing to restore with CARES funding 18. That's not restoring the 14. There's a total of 32 kindergarten teaching assistants. We're maintaining 18 of them on CARES funding. 2.0 FTE high school assistant principals, 1 system admin position in the IT department, and then a 0.5 social service manager position. So that's a summary of the difference between the first scenario, I'll start calling it scenario A. That's the difference in staffing between scenario A and the new scenario B with new assumptions in the benefit rate. And again, I'm going to summarize all these numbers in a final slide. Just kind of put a bow on everything and summarize things. So CARES, so that was general fund scenario B. This is general fund scenario B. Now we're going to jump outside the book and go to CARES scenario B. So, and I'm going to show an itemized list of this as well. So here's the total numbers. I believe, so if you look my cursor here, this number for scenario A was a little over 9 million. And it jumps up about 1.5 million. Somebody said about 1.5, scenario B was about 1.5 cuts and 1.5 added to CARES. There it is. Okay, so this is the summary, leaving about 4.5 million for FY '24. Here's the proposed CARES budget for FY '23 under scenario B. You're going to see similar numbers in the top end, and the differences is going to start to come into play the bottom portion. So here are the 18 teaching assistants, the sysadmin, the SSM, the assistant principals. And then we do have the CEC lease and custodial restored with CARES funds. So we're proposing the removal of that expenditure out of the general fund budget, but restoring it with CARES funds. Was that your question, Ms. Sanderson? I want to jump back to that.
Yes, and did you cut the custodial by 1?
It's like a 0.4.
Okay.
It's not a full, it's a fraction. Something like 0.3 or 0.4.
It's split between another, okay.
Yeah. Yep. So in summary, so when you're thinking scenario A, scenario B CARES, about 9.1 million in scenario A, scenario B it jumps to 10.6. So basically we're absorbing half of the $3.2 million additional required reductions with CARES, and the other half we're proposing to be eliminated outright. All the way to the there we go. Okay, that's where, yep. So there's your 10.6. Just saw the detail of that. And then total positions covered, if you recall, it was about 99.5 in scenario A up to 121.4 in scenario B. So here's an itemized list of the changes to CARES under scenario B. And it's going to be similar. It's going to be similar to the comparison, the itemized changes in scenario A. Really the difference is the added. So we're adding, in addition to the ads, it was about 6 FTE. We're adding the teaching assistants and then 1.9 other positions, the recruiting tech. It's about 21 FTE that we're adding to CARES under scenario B. So here we'll just bottom line it. Here's the comparisons of CARES, the two CARES scenarios. Again, the 99.5 FTE, about $9.2 million expended in scenario A, 10.6 million in scenario B, and moving from 99 to 121, difference of about 22 FTE, an increase. Again, these numbers subject to change on a weekly basis. And again, this is kind of a redundant slide, but again, just there's the itemized ads seen side by side. Overall staff reductions. So this is CARES and general fund combined. So when we look at all the reductions being made, general fund in scenario A, CARES funds reductions, how does that compare to scenario B? So middle column, scenario A, 74 CARES positions reduced. 29.4 general fund for a total of 103, just shy of 104. In scenario B, it's 52 CARES funds reduced because we added back in the 21 in scenario B. And then general fund reductions increased by about 40 FTE up to 68, just shy of 69, for a total of 121 FTE reductions. So if you're looking at real bottom line staff impact, this is the slide right here. And here's the 2-year step down plan. I've talked about this often in several meetings. This kind of outlines where we're at and the path forward. How do we right the ship and get to where we need to be over a couple of year period of time. Current FY23, 19 million. This is how we get out of it. Talked about that with Mr. Doran there earlier. There's the 7 million in regular general fund CARES expenditures. Projected FY24 becomes 11 million. And the way that becomes 11 million is the 7 million in regular general fund CARES carried over. That's gonna be our starting point. And then we'll have the final year of the hold harmless step down. It'll go from 25% hold harmless in 23 down to, it goes away in 24. So then it'll just become actual enrollment. That will drive our state revenue in 24. And then the $2 million in salary increases is a rough number on the cost of steps when we grant a step to all eligible employees. That's a round number of what that cost is to the district. So if we were to implement this proposed budget, general fund as well as CARES, it would create, the estimate is about $11 million deficit for our starting point as we started this process a year from now for FY24. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. DeGraw. And thank you so much for your team and all the effort and work they've put into this. We really appreciate them. Questions from the board? I'm going to go to Ms. Smith first and then Mr. Doran.
Thank you. Can you tell me why we have the projected decline in enrollment of 294 more students?
Yeah, the majority of that decline is looking at actuals. So we dropped around a couple hundred in our 20-day count. We were down to the 12,260s. And then I just have to take into consideration the past 10 to 20 years. I mean, we're just in an overall general declining in student enrollment environment. I often get the question, why not project more? Why not, we could, and this is a valid point, we could see continued students returning from homeschool programs. We could see, as COVID-19, knock on wood, hopefully the negative effects of the pandemics continue to dissipate, and maybe we do see a bounce back in enrollment. Here's the complication of that approach is that we commit to our staffing levels in March, April, May timeframe. We commit to staffing levels based on our enrollment projections. When enrollment projections in August come in below our projections that we make right now, the district unfortunately is on the hook to pay for those staff members, but we don't receive the revenue. So we're projecting a state revenue directly tied to the enrollment projection. When we come in 300 students below that in August, we lose revenue tied to 300 students. But we still have to maintain the staffing costs related to that projection. We pay for that through fund balance, so our cash reserves. And we have over the last several years. Every year I've been in the district, we've had, the pandemic year was huge. It was in the neighborhood of $8 to $10 million that we had to subsidize. But the 2 other years, this is my 4th budget cycle, the 2 other years we had small enrollment declines, but nonetheless, my first year, it equaled $2 or $3 million in additional staff costs relative to the revenue that we receive for students. And so if we have fund balance, we can afford to take the risk of, fewer students coming in. We have resources on the sideline to pay for that. And there's benefits from that. Smaller class sizes, more supports for kids, but unfortunately now that our fund balance has been drained to basically zero, we don't have the luxury of being able to pay for staff that we don't receive revenue for the students. And so really it's kind of becomes a risk. We're unable to take the risk, and so we're forced to project lower student enrollments. Now, the caveat there, and we have the principal group, phenomenal people to work with. Our district has phenomenal principals. And certainly the concept that I'm describing can cause some angst and consternation for principals. Absolutely, I feel that as, Sandy and Nico and I are putting things together and looking at staffing sheets. I feel it, I see it, and I feel it, and it's real. It's a hard process to get through, and so kudos to our principals. They handle it with professionalism, and it's just a great group of folks, men and women. What we commit to principals is if and when, either district-wide or at specific schools, the students do show up in the fall, we are committed to staff where the students show up. And if we have to hire additional teachers, we will do that. And we have done that in several occasions this year, where even mid-year students, levels pop up, like a kindergarten class and supports at other elementary schools. And so we are committed to do that when students come in, either overall at higher levels or in specific schools at specific places and in specific classes. We're committed to taking care of staff and students. So that's important to know. Great question.
Mr. Doran and then Ms. Sanderson.
Okay, if I may follow up on that, and then one other. We're projecting a reduction. We had 1,000 students approximately from last year to this year. We're projecting a reduction, and I understand that in terms of caution, and we do have a declining borough population and child population within the borough. But how does that, where we indicate we're expecting an increase in enrollment in BEST? So in terms of our district enrollment projection, we're expecting, do I understand this correctly, we're expecting a greater number of students to leave our brick and mortar buildings?
So if I recall correctly, we're projecting a status quo BEST enrollment right around 720, 725.
But we're adding teachers because of increased.
That's really a retroactive add. They've been really a staff member short, and so that's really a retroactive add to get them into the roughly 150 to 1 range.
Okay, which was reduction from the year before. There was a lower enrollment or higher enrollment the year before. BEST came in lower this year. But okay, so that it wasn't caught in there.
Correct.
Okay, all right. And if I might, when you mentioned the hold harmless, this year it's a 3.5 gap. So do I understand next year that it drops to 2 million and then the following year would be 0?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's based on the assumptions there is the main assumption there is a status quo BSA, and then that's the enrollment projection of 12,191. It's applying the current projection to that FY24. That's where we get the 2 million.
Okay.
Those are the main assumptions.
Thank you. And if you could put me back on the key.
Can do. Ms. Sanderson, Mr. Sampson, and then Mr. Doran.
So, Mr. DeCraw, is it fair to say that the other roadblock per se would be when you have to project numbers to the Juno, how they're funding, if they would change some of their timelines, that it would benefit us, but because they don't, okay.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. I could make some suggestions to Juno. There's a list of a few things that I could, but yeah, timing is problematic here. Yeah, that's a fair statement.
Mr. Sampson, then Mr. Dorn.
Thank you, President Luke. I just want to hone in on the projected student enrollment for next year. Obviously, it's prudent to play it safe. I do want to point out that we can look at the student enrollment within our district and deduce or interpolate where we will be next year just by a given trend. It's been going down and down and down, as the chart showed us, since 2013. Now, we have to be careful. I just want to point this out. We have to be careful to deduce what do we attribute that to. Because if you look at the borough population, there's times in which it does not directly correlate to the decrease in students. So I just would like to say that there is something else at play concerning the drop in student population. And it is not directly tied to the decrease in the borough's population. That is all.
Mr. Dorn.
Okay. In part, I'm just trying to correlate numbers. And for the public who may be looking at these documents, on page 25 of your, or slide 25, and page 6 in the booklet. I had the question in terms of the booklet, and then when I saw the slide tonight, I think some numbers are just reversed in the boxes.
They are.
Okay.
We caught that. You have.
All right.
That's a good idea.
And my question in terms of on page 6, one category, the support services instruction sees a 53%.
So, Mr. Dorn, those numbers are transposed. So
On the
yes,
slide.
yes. So the 135.6 drops down to student support services student, and then the 64.73 pops up to support services instruction. And we caught that, and we'll fix that.
Okay,
in the
so
next- in
the
the next
slide is the correct one.
Correct.
Okay, so that the increase in the 106%, and I do know that a number of positions were just transferred out of one department when I went through the general, the big sections, the broad sections of each department.
Correct.
That there were a number of positions that were actually just transferred over, they didn't change.
Moved. Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So that'll be there. And then I was just going to note the district administration support. There are only 2 positions that were reduced out of district administration
That's correct.
so far. Okay.
And to Mr. Doran's points, just I forgot to mention earlier, the scenario B, we're somewhat certain that we will be moving forward with scenario B as our new proposed budget for the board to work, quote unquote. We will have a new completed book for you very shortly. I don't want to commit gonna get something thrown at me, but approximately a week's time, we're hopeful to have a new book to you reflecting scenario B.
And also for the public, we will be going through this tomorrow at our regular board meeting. Maybe not quite in as much detail, but we will be going through this on multiple occasions through our work sessions to ensure that the public understands what's going on within our budget process, and for us to be able to look into specific details and understand how the entire budget comes together as a whole, so that as we go forward, we can make the right decisions for the district. It's students, the educators that are within us, and as well as the community as a whole. So just as a reminder, we will be going through this again tomorrow and multiple times over the next month or so. Mr. Dorn.
I have two questions, if I may. I think that'll take me for tonight. Question on the transportation fund. Typically, we have always count an amount that we have to subsidize out of our general fund for that. Because of the inability to fulfill the busing contract this year, has that reduced that subsidy? And then where does that go back into the general fund, or what's?
Yes, so from a budgeting perspective, we do account for a certain amount of fund balance utilization out of the transportation fund. When the provider comes in with fewer routes supplied than what we budget for, it reduces that drain on the fund balance. So those funds just remain in the transportation fund balance.
But that could be available if, I know it's a fine line, so don't give me a definitive answer.
Yeah.
But it could be available since it was not needed for this year. That our subsidy, there may be more in that fund. I won't say substantial at this point. More in that fund because of not having to use as much of what we have to subsidize next year.
So technically, that's correct, Mr. Dorn. I would just, the huge word of caution would be that as our routes get nearer to the budgeted number of routes, the deficit in the transportation fund increases significantly very fast. And so that's one thing. So as I'm looking at the guts of the numbers and really into the weeds, and one of the things, I'll just thank you for the question because it allowed me to address this point. 5 years ago, we were transferring 1.5, somewhere between $1 million and $2 million to that fund to keep it afloat. That's about what the shortfall is of the revenue we receive for transportation and it's probably more now because our routes, our daily rates, the costs of providing transportation goes up every year. And so technically, yes, funds could be available, but I would just caution really using a significant amount of those funds, because as we get routes back to where they need to be, there's going to be significant deficits in that operation, and what it will require is restoring. Right now, we've eliminated the transfer from the general fund. That's been a huge benefit to the general fund. Currently, we're transferring zero to transportation, so that's provided relief, temporary relief. But at some point in the future, once we get back closer to full service, it's going to start running a deficit again, and we'll be forced to subsidize it again absent us advocating in Juneau for those numbers to be adjusted. And we've talked often about that in our legislative committee meetings, and I know we're going to talk about that this year again. And I see it coming on the radar in Juneau. It does most every year, but hopefully at some point I get some traction. But so technically, yes, available, but I would just really caution significant usage of those funds, just because the funds can be depleted quickly, and then it's going to create a significant strain on general fund resources.
Caution noted, and I appreciate that. But it's good to know, especially at a time when we're closing schools in order to save money. So my other question, I had one more, if you want to put me in the key.
Why don't we end with that one question? It doesn't look as though there's any other questions from the board. We can end with that, considering the time, and we can pick back up tomorrow during the budget.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the answer, because I also don't want to bog down tomorrow. It's too much. But just to see whether I'm on the right track, and I know we'll get into details later on individual departments, but as I went through the departments, except for SPAD, which sees a significant increase, about 800,000, the next, almost everyone gets a decrease from hundreds of thousands to a few thousand. Except for BEST has a 575,000. Did I read those correctly? That's an increase to BEST.
Yes, specifically the allotments, Mr. Dorn.
Okay, so that'll be something when we get to the department discussions, we'll take a close look at those. Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I understood those numbers right.
Can
Mr.
I make a final statement for the evening? I know it's I'm starting to get feedback that, you know, it's difficult to hear talk of numbers, and I think I want to and need to make a general statement that I want folks to know that I care about this district deeply, and I realize that at some point, you know, myself, my office, we're in the weeds of the numbers. Sometimes, you know, the work can start to become impersonal, but I want people to know that I know that we get at providing an education to students through the budget. We have to have, unfortunately, we have to have money to do that, and that's why we end up talking about the money, right? The resources. But I want folks to know, I want the board to know that my office, myself, we realize the personal, the human impacts that this has, and these are hard conversations. I understand that completely. And it's a burden that I carry, but that I want people to know that I'm aware of it and I take it seriously. And unfortunately, we live in an environment where our revenue is set. You know, I wish we had a printing press like the federal government. Unfortunately, we don't. You know, yeah, better that we don't, right? And so we have to, unfortunately, live within the resources that we're provided. And I know that we have advocacy efforts lined up, and we're gonna have conversations about how do we increase the revenues that we have. I think that's a very important side of the conversation to have, and have many of those conversations, and to advocate and to tell stories. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, we have to balance we have to live within our means. But just want people to know that I'm aware of the human side of all these conversations, and I'm committed to helping the organization make good decisions with the resources we have to provide the best education we can for students. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, we will see you all here tomorrow evening. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Meeting is adjourned.